Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Susan Ward. I'm with the Bureau of Student Wellness, and I am joined by my colleagues, Lisa, Catherine, and Molly. And we're going to turn today's session over to Catherine.
Thanks, Susan, for getting us started. My name is Catherine Leswing, and I'm going to be talking today about classroom management as educators and districts start thinking about going back to the school building in some places, doing completely remote in others, and a combination of both known as hybrid in other places. So we know that this is really going to shift how we think about classroom management from past years. And so we wanted to share some primarily resources with you today so that you can feel prepared as you head back into the school year. So the first slide, let's see, click it, there we go. The first slide, I just wanted to really define what classroom management is. I know that as teachers and educators, we often kind of have a hunch, we know, and there's 1,000,001 definitions out there for classroom management. So I just pulled this one. I thought it summed it up pretty nicely. It's from an article called Managing Your Classroom for Success from Science and Children. And it states that classroom management is all the things a teacher does to organize students, space, time, and materials so that student learning can take place. And I thought that was a nice, succinct way of thinking about it. And so as we go through the presentation today, the resources that I share are going to be connected to those 4 topics of how to organize students, space, time, and materials in the different modalities for learning that we might see this year. They also talked about different pillars of classroom management. And one that they spoke of that was actually some of the first research ever done on classroom management in the 1970s was this concept of with itness. And I think as a teacher, most educators really kind of know what that looks like or feels like. It's the eyes in the back of your head, you're with it, you know your students, and you know what's going on in your classroom. Another aspect of this is relationships, which we talk about a ton in our office. And really the research shows over and over again that those relationships can be the foundation for good classroom management. We'll talk a little bit about that later and some resources for you. Momentum and consistency. So not just on the first day of school do we talk about classroom management and think about it, but does the teacher and educator have the momentum and the consistency to follow through with management in the classroom? And that leads us to classroom procedures, which is really the guidelines that are going to be facing outwards towards the students and that they will learn and hopefully internalize as they go throughout the year and are learning in the classroom. So I guess I just want to open it up to my colleagues who are here and have a wealth of experience in classroom settings. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about what pillar of classroom management from here you were really drawn to or felt like you fell back on when you were in the classroom.
That's a great question, Catherine. One of the pillars that I was really drawn to was classroom procedure. I think having real clear expectations and procedures for our students was kind of my way of, just making sure we're all on the same page. So a lot of times we would practice the classroom procedures. I would have like exemplary examples. And then for silliness, I taught elementary ed. So we'd do like, what does it not look like? Show me what it doesn't look like to be standing in a straight line. But really having those like concrete examples and then finding a way to make it fun was just something that I was really drawn to. My school as a whole practiced 100%. So when you were looking to do a specific classroom procedure, you waited for your 100% of your students to be in compliance, which I thought was kind of hard with younger students, but it also, it brought some awareness to my students when I'd say, oh, it looks like only 50% of us are, ready to travel in the hallway. It kind of made them look around and be like, well, am I part of, which 50% am I part of? Mm-hmm. So I love classroom management. I love thinking about it, but I think having clear procedures and expectations is really what I was drawn to.
I would have to agree. I definitely love my classroom procedures and getting them all set up in the beginning of the year and really practicing those. And once those are set, it's almost like it becomes part of the routine. But I think the other one too is the relationships and relationships. You hear me talk about quite a bit. I think they're so important between teacher family, teacher student, and really establishing those strong relationships. I know you've heard me say it before, really just connect that student to the work, to the teacher, to the commitment of learning. And when things do get a little bit in the gray or things do get a little bit uncertain, you know, you have that relationship to fall back on.
Definitely.
So I grew up in England and Germany, and discipline was very different there. Where do you think discipline and behavior falls into this model?
That's a good question. And I think, you know, looking at this, you don't see, you know, discipline as one of the legs of the spider. And thinking about why that might be. As we get into this discussion a little bit later, I'll share a resource that talks about behavior. Any behavior that we see is really an unmet need asking to be met from a student. And so if we think of it that way, discipline is definitely part of classroom management. For me, it maybe falls more into that momentum piece and that consistency piece. So yes, it's important to enforce the classroom procedures and make sure they're being met, but almost, and so in that sense, it could become a pillar here. But for me, I was thinking, as Susan and Molly were talking, that momentum, even though that's almost like the unsung hero of classroom management, because when you get to the end of the day and you have, a parent to talk to that you need to reach out to, or something you need to follow up on, and it would be so much easier to just go home and not deal with it. Will you take the time to follow up on it and make sure that that follow-up happens, whether it's in the form of discipline or reaching out to a family member or someone in the school building. So I'm not sure if that answers your question directly, Lisa, and maybe if Molly and Susan have something they want to add.
I think, Catherine, you're kind of spot on in thinking about discipline kind of falls into all of these categories. So, right, like when you have great classroom procedures and really solid relationships and you've built up the momentum, the student behaviors are kind of caught before they happen, because students want to succeed and want to feel like they're doing well. So if you have all those great systems already in place, it mitigates a lot of those behaviors right off the bat.
Yeah, that said, I did have a ladder of, I don't even think I called them consequences. It was simply like when expectations are not met. First, this happens. I might just try to redirect you. Second, we might meet in the hall. Third, I might, so there is a ladder, and I think it's as important to communicate those as the procedures themselves. So I think that's a really valid point, Lisa. Just for the sake of time, I think I'll keep us moving and thinking about, so how will classroom management there look in these different modalities that we will experience going back to school this fall? So how will classroom management look differently in person than it may have even last year, with different precautions being taken for COVID? How will it look in the virtual environment, and how will it translate to a combination of those two in the hybrid model? So all of the resources that I guidance that I've provided, I've sort of divided up into those three categories. So the first part of classroom management, thinking about organizing students. I've just put down some general ideas about what considerations might be worthwhile to think about as we head back to school. So in person, this doesn't really change a whole lot from previous years, taking the time to get to know your students, maybe taking extra time this year, having been away from students for so long and students needing that connection and those relationships. Planning for your behavior expectations and practice and referring to them often. Again, most people learn this in their teacher certification programs, but I can't tell you the number of times I thought to myself, man, I probably should have reviewed my behavior expectations after that long weekend, and so now this is much longer than a long weekend. So students are going to need that reinforcement, and having a consistent process and response when expectations aren't met. And really those are the foundation for, let's see if I can click over here, the hybrid model and the virtual model. So those things aren't going to change regardless of the modality that we're learning in. What you might want to consider also when you're going to virtual though, is that you're being the lead learner and modeling being the lead learner as much as you're the teacher. We know that tech difficulties happen. We had them happen right before we were doing this session. It can be frustrating for everybody involved. And as the adult and the teacher, how can we model when things don't go as planned? And can we say, oh, that was a learning experience, and next time I'm going to adjust for this, or that's okay when mistakes happen and we will do this instead. To that end, spending extra time helping students troubleshoot technology will pay dividends if we're doing it at the beginning of the year. And then maybe considering what are your office hours for when technology isn't working, and setting those guidelines for yourself, because we know that with working remotely, time can just sort of run all together, and we want to make sure that we're setting firm guidelines for when students can get help and when the workday has come to an end. So these are some resources that might be of use when thinking about how to manage classrooms. Most classroom teachers, if it's not your first year, have their own sort of toolkit all ready to go. But we did want to just connect you with some of these. Molly will be populating the comment section with these links, and so you'll be able to just click right over to those as we go through them. Scholastic has a nice little toolkit, a collection of resources for teachers all about classroom management. This is really your sort of traditional classroom management toolkit. It talks about, how do I do it? How do I set up class rules, set up an organization of the classroom, and how to deal with behavior problems. Teaching Tolerance has put out a toolkit for reframing classroom management. So it's more of a restorative approach. So where Scholastic has a more traditional approach, Teaching Tolerance has asked us to rethink what problem behavior might be about. And when I referenced, behavior being aimed at meeting an unmet need, this is a whole toolkit that gets educators thinking about that. And I think that's especially critical as we head back this fall, and students are going to have behaviors because they've had some needs not met. In particular, every student has probably had a decrease in the socialization that they really needed. And so if we see behavior problems in the classroom, in the physical classroom, they really might be just crying out for the fact that they need to interact with their peers more. And so how can we recognize that and address it in a way that's that repairs harm and moves forward? Some of these resources can be used across the board. They're not specific to the modality. Common Sense Media has a really nice list of different classroom management apps and websites that I recommend folks take a look at. There's a breadth of information out there, and they do a nice job of reviewing each of these different apps for you. One of the apps in particular that I really like and know educators who have used it is the Remind app. And that is a way to keep communication flowing between you, your students, and families in a way that's safe and protected. So it's a platform to send messages to parents and students that's not connected to your cell phone number, but you can do it from right from your cell phone. And as we think about how we will really be living in the unknown, a gray area about what path the virus is going to take, what adjustments we're willing to take throughout the year, having that open line of communication will be great. And the Remind app is one way to do that and to think about it. And then thinking about how do we organize students in the virtual space. My colleague Lisa Hayward is going to do a whole session about this tomorrow. A couple of quick resources to think about for this is the virtual classroom management tips offered by Manageme. They're a learning management system, and I just thought it was a nice, succinct list of considerations to think about as we set a virtual learning space, including setting rules and expectations ahead of time, establishing your routine, and dealing with discipline immediately as it happens virtually. And Lisa will dig into that deeper tomorrow. And last but not least, this one really falls into the category of all of these modalities, is the Search Institute. We reference their work a lot. They've done a ton of research, surveying students across the country, hundreds of thousands of students at this point, learning about what protective factors exist and how developmental relationships are really the #1 protective factor for students. And they have a whole bunch of free resources on their webpage there. And so as teachers, we can think about how our relationships can help students move through this difficult time and this uncertain time. And like Molly and Susan and Lisa mentioned, those relationships are so critical as a form of classroom management and just raising good humans. So that leads us to thinking about the classroom space. In the governor's guidance and the START Task Force guidance, they did have some actual language that recommended doing certain protocols. So they recommend that when you're in the in-person environment, it's as static as possible. Distance is maximized, the physical distance between students. And then providing physical signage, such as tape on floors or signs on the walls. In addition, I think this could look like very clear entry and exit and movement procedures in the classroom. Generally speaking, you probably already had those without this extra guidance. And so what will those look like, and planning for that. Also maybe considering full class group work. I think a lot of teachers, we like to have our different small groupings and activities and, things that aren't teacher centered. How will that shift when we are all in a classroom that's physically distanced? And so maybe thinking about games and things you can do as a full class that feel fun and take the burden off the teacher a little bit. As far as virtual management of space, again, the guidance said it will require policies that were not part of a school landscape prior to COVID-19. So thinking about, again, my colleague Lisa will go into this tomorrow, attendance, knowing your learning management system and being fluid with it to keep it organized, teaching and reteaching how to use the platform, clear entry, exit, camera, microphone, privacy procedures, and using small groups and breakout rooms are ways that you could help to organize the space in a way that's fun and engaging and keeps students on track. And last but not least, about both of these modalities kind of feeding into the hybrid model. The last thing I'll say about the hybrid model is you might want to consider using content from your from the virtual lessons and bringing that back into the physical classroom to keep students engaged and thinking, oh, I do actually need to use the material from my online platform to keep going when I'm in class. All right. So a few resources here. EdSurge did a great article, What Does Classroom Design Look Like in the Age of Social Distancing? They had a few big things that they pulled out. Signage and first impressions. We all know how it felt when we walked into a classroom that we absolutely loved to learn in, and can you recreate that with physical distancing? I think we can, but it's going to take some creativity. And what is the first impression that your students will get when they walk into your classroom? They also suggested maximizing the perimeter of the classroom. Maybe you could have a classroom where you can get students distanced, but they're in a circle arrangement. So they're physically distanced, but they can all see each other. Minimize teacher only space. That's always been sort of a recommendation. I like to have my personal desk that didn't have hands all over it, but if we are tight for space, minimizing that space is a good recommendation. And then lastly, I think is super important is optimizing movement in the classroom. And so how do you do that distance when kids are supposed to be static? You can do all sorts of creative activities with them standing up behind their desk, head, shoulders, knees, and toes. Older kids will love it too. I used to do like fire feet with my high school students. Anybody likes to get up and move and have their brain activated that way. And then looking at virtual classroom management tips, again, going back to the Vidamo virtual classroom ideas, you should already have that link. And then tomorrow, my friend Lisa is going to be talking about creating a netiquette and internet etiquette and online climate and culture considerations. So she'll be getting you a lot more ideas for thinking about the virtual and hybrid classroom space. I also wanted to include some things about how to make it fun. A lot of educators are already familiar with these games, but they can be done from a distance. So Kahoot is a game you can play as a full class. Kids need their own device, so a computer or a cell phone, but they can sit together and they can play as a class a game, a quiz game that the teacher is running. There are many Kahoots already made that you can just draw down or you can make your own. Ed Puzzle is a great way to have students watch educational videos and answer questions right in the platform. And as the teacher, you can go back and see what percentage your kids did and what percentage they got correct. You can also prevent skipping, which I always felt was a useful a tool as a teacher. And it's a free platform. All of these that you can use for free to some degree. Quizlet requires, I think it's a $25 subscription for the teacher subscription, but you can use it for free without it. With the subscription, you get to see more of what your kids are doing inside Quizlet. But one of the things that my students love to do was play Quizlet Live, which was a fun game you could do in the classroom. Each kid does need a device though, but it's a great way for reviewing material or playing a whole group game. All right, so next we're talking about organizing classroom time and then organizing classroom materials, and then we are done. So organizing classroom time, teaching time management skills, something that I think I may have been skipped over some questions from my colleagues. So let me just, does anybody want to pop in and chat about anything I've gone through? I know I'm providing a lot of content.
So yeah, I think one of the questions that we were going to discuss a little bit was planning for organizing the virtual classroom. So thinking about how you yourself can organize your classroom and how you can help organize it for your students. I know in my experience working with younger students, that's definitely a challenge that I would have to explore in terms of if I'm assigning them online worksheets or, however they're creating quizzes and those types of things, how are they going to keep track of what they are doing and have completed and turning them in? And I know some of our colleagues were talking about even in the physical space, how are you going to manage that to limit walking around and moving through the classroom and that type of stuff too?
Yeah, those are really good considerations. I almost want to pass it to Lisa because I feel like she has the deepest knowledge on this, if you're comfortable taking it, Lisa.
Yeah, and I think I want to start out by saying that I've been developing and teaching online classes for 15 years, but it's been for older people. And the more organized, first of all, the older the student is, the easier it is to work in the virtual environment with them because they're more disciplined. They can type up a Word document, then they don't have to draw a picture, they're not using crayons, for example. So it's much easier to use technology in classrooms for older students. But definitely, the one walk away that I'll say to anybody is if you can create an organized virtual classroom that's consistent from week to week, so organized in terms of week, the more organized you are and the more consistent you are, the easier it's going to be for your students, regardless of their age. So that consistency in organizing anything is so key. think also when you're working with younger students, you might be working with their parents too in the virtual environment. So the parents are going to want that same nice organized structure so that they can help their children. So consistent organization from week to week is key to success. But it can be done. But it is definitely easier for older students than younger students.
Yeah, and I think that actually really speaks to this slide about organizing classroom time and thinking about developmentally what do students have the attention span for. And if others want to jump in or share things on that, please feel free to do so. But looking at the virtual environment for time management, I think teaching time management skills is good, especially when so much stuff is going to be done independently, not in the classroom with the teacher prompting it. But again, I'm sure you'll talk about this tomorrow too, Lisa, meeting more frequently for less time, if that's a possibility, or just meeting for less time, because we all have a shorter attention span when it comes to being in front of a screen. And so how do we maximize that so that student learning is taking place? Because at a certain point, the learning drops off, right? And whatever was attempted to convey and have students retain is going to be lost if the session is too long. That goes for our session right now too. So I feel like, that's something to really be mindful of. And then to that end as well, you can use small groups and breakout rooms to really take the burden off teachers. I think many of us were in a session yesterday where breakout rooms were used really effectively that made it feel engaging in a way that sometimes a live classroom is, if it and using a timer. And then I'm not sure. So thinking that the in-person considerations and the virtual considerations are both relevant when you're doing the hybrid. Does anybody have anything else to add to that before I move on to the next slide?
I'll just add one thing, because I think you touched on something really important, and that's you might meet more frequently for less time. The science is really clear that the brain works much, much harder in a virtual Zoom kind of learning environment. So bear in mind that in a traditional classroom, when you're in person, you might be able to lecture or talk to your students quite easily for 45 minutes about whatever your topic is, life under the ocean. But in the online environment, if you're giving a lecture in the Zoom environment, limit that to half an hour or 20 minutes. The brains of the students are working so hard to focus for 20 minutes that you're far better off giving them a shorter lecture than a longer lecture in the online environment, simply because of the brain capacity. So that was a really great point, Catherine.
Yeah, thank you for that, background too. I think it's important. It's not, just a recommendation. The science actually shows it. So thank you, Lisa. So we're going to jump into organizing classroom materials, and then I'll share a few resources, few additional resources, and we'll wrap up. So organizing your classroom materials, this is one will be tougher in person. So the guidance from the START task force says that when possible, avoid the use of shared materials. So that's going to take a little more planning and forethought as a teacher, and it's not going to be perfect, and that's okay. And I think accepting that being back in a school building presents risk, and there's no way to get around it, and to accept that there is risk involved, and then to say, how can we minimize it to the best of our ability? Consider posting worksheets and material, especially for older students, on your learning management system. Minimize contact through that would happen through handing out materials. And then the same really goes for the virtual and hybrid methods. I think as much as you can do assignment submission and handing out through the virtual platform, the less risk is involved. But of course there will be risk. Recognizing that you guys mentioned that distance learning gets easier as students get older, how might teachers navigate keeping materials safe with younger learners in the in-person environment? I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on that.
So you're asking about the in-person environment and keeping actual materials safe.
Yeah, I think
Yeah, we can be so creative with that. So for example, have students have their own individual drop boxes on their desk where they might put a piece of paper so they don't have to get up and bring it forward, you know, that will minimize their exposure to other students. I think probably Molly has got some good ideas on this one.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about it, and it's great to say, each kid will have their own scissors and their own glue and their own colored pencils, but there's still this is something I kind of grapple with because I remember the student that consistently lost their glue cap and their glue was always dried out, or like those those little things. So I think it will take a certain amount of creativity on the teacher's part, and circling back to those procedures. Part of a lesson is going to have to be, okay, we're going to cap our glues now if that's what your students need. And doing quick checks, are all my items where they belong, just so we know the younger kids can be accountable for those materials. Because yeah, when it comes down to it, you can give each child their resources, but having them keep them for an entire calendar year is the real struggle.
definitely. I would also, with older kids, I would sometimes sneak a classroom procedures question in on a quiz, or a couple of them on a quiz. It was sort of a low-hanging fruit, but it also kept those things in the forefront of their minds. So that was a great recommendation, Molly. All right, so a couple of resources that might be of use, again, is the EdSurge article that was already shared about, what does good classroom design look like in the age of social distancing. They do have some suggestions for classroom materials in there. And then this Edutopia article, which I was pleasantly surprised when I opened it. A former colleague who actually started the project Classroom, or the Modern Classrooms project, we had them on earlier this year. He wrote this article, and he's been doing distance learning or flipped classrooms for several years at this point. And he shared 4 great tips for how to shift to online teaching, in particular as it pertains to materials and submission of work, etc. All right. So just a couple of local resources as we wrap up here. The National Education Association for New Hampshire has a lot of resources on their page. One entire collection of materials called Safely Reopening Our Schools, which is New Hampshire specific. Media Power Youth is a Manchester-based nonprofit organization that focuses on media literacy, and they have great prepackaged lessons for educators. And I think this is going to be a big topic as we head back into the school year, and students are using technology in new ways or just using technology a lot. And then last but not least, a plug for some of our own content. The New Hampshire Department of Education has our whole remote learning webpage, newhampshirelearnsremotely.com, and in particular has supports for remote instruction. Funding considerations, communication and quality improvement are always important to think about. How will classroom management be communicated to families? How will we know that our classroom management strategies are working? And how can we continue to fund them? Classroom management largely can be carried out without significant funding, but you might want to think about, as a school, do you need some resources for that? And so we've shared some links to ideas where you might be able to draw down money for social emotional wellness or whole child efforts under the guise of classroom management. And last but not least, classroom management and MTSSB. We always like to talk about how this idea fits into our work. And when we think about MTSSB, we're talking about organizing people in a strategic way to analyze data, make a plan, implement evidence-based strategies, and evaluate outcomes. And when we think about classroom management, that's really what the goal is. How will we analyze behavior data to choose evidence-based strategies for our classrooms and then evaluate the outcomes of those strategies? This is largely left to teachers right now to do on an individual basis. And with MTSSB, we're really thinking about how can whole school buildings start to think this way about classroom management? How can whole districts start to think this way about what are the ways we can maximize outcomes for our students with the practices and the procedures that we use in the school building? So with that concludes our long list of resources for classroom management as we head back to school. And we are down to our very last technical assistance session tomorrow with Lisa. If you found the information useful today, we really hope you will join tomorrow because she will be going more in depth with virtual culture and climate. I thank you so much for tuning in, and we will be back here tomorrow. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.